good to have. And it's a treat for me to be among so many good public servants. Some of you have been friends and sources of mine for a long time. You're the people who give the rest of us the luxury of taking clean water and safe streets and quick response times for granted. Thank you for that. And I want to pay a compliment to a coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, since you were so kind to me. I have been indeed following your development for a long time, and I consider you one of the most important lobbying forces of the Capitol because of the quality of the arguments that you bring. You marshal facts and you deal in facts. You are genuinely bipartisan or nonpartisan, but genuinely advocates for your region, and yet you're not engaged in divide and conquer politics. And that's important, and it actually pertains to the theme that I want to talk about today. You have been a force, I think, for keeping Minnesota one state. And I think that I'd like to invite you this afternoon to think with me about the power of that idea of Minnesota as one state, one economic unit, one force for the development of a good life for all of its people. I think that idea is under some threat right now. And I'd like for us to think together this afternoon about how we can keep that threat at bay. Now, you might say, what does somebody from the Minneapolis newspaper know about getting Minnesota together as one state? So I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about my background. Some of you may know already that I'm not a native Minnesotan. I grew up in Del Rapids, South Dakota, which happens to be the hometown of the current governor of South Dakota, Dennis Ugard. He was my classmate in high school. So I'm not a city girl, at least not natively so. And as I would grow up, we were just a few miles from the Minnesota border, and we looked to the Twin Cities as our metropolitan area, not Omaha or Chicago or any place like that. The Twin Cities was sort of ours, in the same way that I think many of you must think of the Twin Cities as somehow yours. When the Twins and Vikings came in 1961, my dad ran the Del Rapids Sportsman's Club, and we'd rent a bus, and off we'd go every year to see a Twins game. Those kind of connections would happen. And as we would drive through the small towns in Minnesota, it would strike me that those towns looked a little more prosperous than the towns I knew in South Dakota. And I thought, oh, that must be some fluke. But no, as I became an adult and started hanging out at the legislature, began to realize the role of state policy in making that difference happen. I came to Minnesota as a young adult, and I sometimes liken that to people who convert to a religion as young adults. When you're an adult convert to a religion, you're often the most devout. Well, those of us who are adult converts to Minnesota in those early years of our adulthood sometimes can be the most into boosterism. And I like to say that the Star Tribune editorial board's real ism isn't liberalism or conservatism, it's boosterism. Now, I think my page is out of order here. I'm missing a page in my text. Well, that's just terrible. The printer has screwed me up. Nope, there it is. There it goes. We're saved. All right. All right. Well, I was a kid who liked history, and when I became an editorial writer, I saw history as an editorial writer's tool. You see, one of the tricks we learn is that if people know a history of a place, they care about it more. And editorial writers are often calling on the readers of newspapers to care about an issue just a little bit more. So I learned that Minnesotans have had this sense about the power of history in a very early way. Did you know that the 5th bill passed by the territorial legislature in 1849 established the Minnesota Historical Society? From the very beginning, people had a sense of history in this state mattered. Now, as I've studied Minnesota history and written a few books that have Minnesota history pertinence, one of the things I learned is that one way to think about Minnesota's history is to think about it as a story of a people who were exceptionally willing to aggregate their resources at the state level, to do things together as a state, to put things together in a way that would have some synergy, that would make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. In the 19th century, this is sort of a story about how things were located. If you notice, we put the government center and the educational center and the commercial center and even the state prison all sort of in the same area. Lots of other states didn't do it that way. They divided up the educational system. They had a state capital out in some central location to the state geographically, but away from the population center. By clustering all those resources in what becomes the Twin Cities, we made it possible for a major metropolitan area to form. And
And that's been just crucial for us now in the 21st century, that we have a major metropolitan area. But that area was fueled financially from the beginning by what was going on around it. And I learned from that 19th century history as well, that the development of much of greater Minnesota was coordinated, planned for by people in the Twin Cities area. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Pillsburys of Minnesota. One of the things I learned, and you may of course know that the Pillsburys own much of the land, still do, that became the Mesabi Range. So they certainly have benefited financially from their connection to northeastern Minnesota. But because of that flour business that they had, and with their connection with the railroad baron James J. Hill, Charles Pillsbury and James J. Hill one day in the early 1880s supposedly chose the site for 200 grain elevators. 200 in western Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. That's power. That's choosing the location of about 200 towns. This was a planned, in many ways, a planned economy that always had this synergy between what was happening in greater Minnesota and what was happening in the metro area. There was a genius move in 1889. It was a move that kept the University of Minnesota intact, putting both the research and the applied sciences all together in one place. Lots of states at that point were dividing off their applied sciences and making a separate campus system. We eventually do develop a state university system, as you well know, but it took another 100 years or so for that to happen in full flower. Keeping the University of Minnesota strong was a big genius move again, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Another genius move was writing into the state constitution state responsibility for a general and uniform system of public education, of schools. That became important in the depths of the Depression in 1933. In Minnesota and in lots of the Midwest, little schools were in trouble because they were unable to pay their teachers. They were reliant on local property taxes. And farmers in that period, mostly a farm economy in rural Minnesota and elsewhere, they couldn't pay their teachers. Teachers were making very little money. They were often boarding with families rather than being able to afford housing, and sometimes those schools were at risk of closure. In 1933, the legislature, then a conservative legislature, but Floyd B. Olson, the farmer labor governor, was in the governor's office. They worked together to create the first state income tax in Minnesota. All the other states in our region had not done that yet. And they dedicated it to education. It was not a constitutional dedication, like the gas tax that is something brittle that people came to resent later on. It was a statutory dedication. It was undone later. But that surge of money that kept the schools strong in Minnesota and also gave the state a policy lever. So that after World War II, when the economy is better, the state says, you know, we'd like, instead of having 8,000 school districts, one in every township, we'd like to see some consolidation. That was an important move for Minnesota, for boosting the quality of education. And boy, has there been a payoff in Minnesota for boosting the quality of education. You can have Art Rolnick come and speak to you about this history of Minnesota's economy and see what a difference that made. Well, in 1971, the Minnesota Miracle happened, and that's a session that some of you in this room will remember. I know Tim says he remembers it. The Minnesota Miracle wasn't, it was this notion that we should use the state resources more, boost the state taxes so that we could rely on property taxes less. It was a decision that cost some local control. We did a trade. We lost some local control for the sake of sustainability and advancement. So the state, for example, the share of state school budgets, on average, after the Minnesota Miracle was passed, went from 43% to 65%. It's a big surge. And at that same time, local government aid was born. Local government aid actually had a predecessor municipal aid program, much smaller. LGA, as we know it, was born as part of the Minnesota Miracle in 1971. And I think there was genius there too. Because LGA was not just for the central cities or just for greater Minnesota's struggling towns. It was for any city in the state whose property tax base was not deemed adequate to affordably provide basic services. That's something that from the start, it offered particular help to cities experiencing a term that was invented there too, municipal overburden. Some of you know that term well. That term was invented about the same time, and that meant that any city whose costs were disproportionately high because that city was a magnet for jobs, or for tourism, or for other kinds of special obligations for their region, or was a site of concentrated poverty, that city was deserving of more LGA. Now, getting the formula right, as you know, has been tricky. It has been something that has been worked on again and again. I remember when John Randolph, the rest is in his memory, the legislator said we would do better if we just flew an airplane over the state and dumped money out of it. That was how bad the formula got at one point. I think the formula is in pretty good shape right now, but I think it's always a work in progress, and that the stewards of this program have a continuing obligation to keep an eye on how the formula is serving the parts of the state that we think are really deserving of service. But the basic idea has not changed, and neither has opposition to this program, which has always been there. It's mostly come from communities that are off the formula. Well, those are the more affluent communities who are deemed to have the low property tax base needed to provide their services. Well, what's their case against LGA? Well, they would say it redistributes, it's hard to say, redistributes wealth, and that's some sort of socialism. They would say that it enables cities to spend money that they don't have, and that discourages efficiency. They can say it flows to big cities who look rich, and that's wasteful, especially when they are accused, those cities, of overpaying their city employees, and that's been in the news just lately. And it has also appeared to me in recent years that LGA is faulted because it goes to places that elect DFLers, and that's of concern. I must say, I would say that what's right with LGA far outweighs those arguments. I think LGA has kept municipal services respectably healthy in every part of the state. It's why that notion of sharing our resources is why those outstate communities continue to look stronger than the ones I drive through in South Dakota or in Iowa when I go there. It has kept property taxes affordable in this state, which is in turn a benefit that leads to more investment by the private sector. And when you have more investment by the private sector, you increase employment, you raise incomes, you reverse blight, you do good things for this state from Waynesboro to Roseau and certainly in northeast Minneapolis as well. Now, I don't think LGA has to be a partisan issue because it's really based on an idea that came out of Richard Nixon's shop in the early 1970s. It's basically revenue sharing. The notion that you send money out and let local officials who are closest to their communities have the authority to spend that money as they see fit. I've written a lot about LGA over the years, and I'm probably not done yet. I see that issue as a kind of a litmus test of this state's willingness to function as one state, to care about each other not only out of human kindness, but also out of enlightened self-interest, which I think is what LGA is about. It's in every Minnesotan's interest to prevent any portion of the state from becoming a locus of intractable poverty. It will not serve us well if we have something akin to an Appalachia develop in our midst here. Persistent poverty's costs to society are simply too high. Now, LGA is not the only issue like that, of course, and you've been talking in these last few days and weeks and months about others. Workforce housing. What a great problem to have. But that's a problem that is real and needs, I think, some kind of statewide input for a solution. The build out of broadband. It is untenable that after 25 years of the internet, since the internet's gone, some Minnesotans still don't have reliable access and are being denied all that the internet has to bring. The big sore subject in this last legislative session was about environmental protection and environmental protection versus economic development. We're going to hear a lot of talk about that. The last legislative session really showed us the power of issues like that to divide Minnesotans. So we're going to need strong leadership from all of you and from people who write editorials like me to insist that in this state we can and will have both clean water and clean air and prosperity. We can have both good economies in the metro area and in outstate. I'd like to invite you to put one more issue on your agenda if it's not there already, and that's the University of Minnesota. How are we going to have this magic of both a clean environment and prosperity around some of the natural resources-based industries that are now undergoing transformation? Well, I think we're going to invent our way there at the University of Minnesota. How are we going to attract the science brain power for a statewide high-tech economy? And believe me, high-tech is in your communities too and will become more so. I think we're going to lure that talent here from other states with the quality of the University of Minnesota. And how are we going to boost incomes in greater Minnesota? I think we're going to invent new ways to add value to our natural resources at the University of Minnesota, the very magic that the university has been working in agriculture and in mining for all of its history? How are we going to cope with the shortage of doctors and other key personnel that some of you are already experiencing in your communities and that will, I think, soon be felt statewide? We're going to have to train more of those people at the University of Minnesota. Well, you maybe heard that this year the legislature appropriated an additional $100 million for MNSCU to operate in the next 2 years, and only $22 million by comparison for the University of Minnesota. Now, that probably plays well in many of your communities that are hosts to MNSCU campuses, and I don't mean in any way to slight MNSCU's important role in this state, but it is short-sighted to underfund the University of Minnesota at this time in our history. Like LGA, the University of Minnesota is important to keeping Minnesota one state. I hope you're talking about that issue too while you're here in Duluth. Well, as I said, it's a treat to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll be around all afternoon and I'll be pulling out my reporter's notebook and playing reporter for the rest of the day. So good to talk with you and hope you have a good conference. Thank you very much.
A little bit on the University of Minnesota investment, but specifically, do you have thoughts? A lot of our cities, well, of course, a couple of them have U of M.
MNSCU campuses.
Yeah, MNSCU, but we all have MNSCU campuses, or a significant amount of them. Is there reform that MNSCU could, in your thought, play in this whole discussion of creating a better kind of technology basis and education base for the state? Because I think I agree with the University of Minnesota, but there are a lot of things happening at MNSCU, some good, maybe some not so good.
Yeah.
And I think that they play economically. Minnesota State, Mankato, in our case, is a significant economic impact for
yes.
our area, and I think could be greater should the funding or the reform within the system change.
No,
do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. And my remarks, I don't mean to take anything away from MNSCU. MNSCU is the trainer of workforce for much of the state, and many of your communities really have benefited enormously from hosting a MNSCU campus or having one in your proximity. Now, I don't want to take anything away from that, but it is important at the same time, I think, that we understand more fully the power of the research function at the university. And it is not likely that those MNSCU campuses will ever be allowed to develop that research capability. It's just not in the cards. To have a research university that plays on the world scale is an expensive proposition. We certainly don't want to have multiples of them. We would just weaken the strong one that we've got if we were to take that approach. So my call for you today is to put on your agenda some sense of how the University of Minnesota, while it doesn't have as many campuses as MNSCU, really affects the future of your community. They are talking about a strategic plan at the university, and I probably won't remember all of its components. But one of the big ones, for example, is food security. How do we stave off hunger? How do we fight hunger when we're projected to have 9 billion people on this planet by 2050? Minnesota can be a leader in that by changing, modifying our agricultural processes and the value that's added to our agricultural products after they are grown. That can all happen in Minnesota and be a great boon, I think, to our economy. Making sure the university is strong enough to play that role well is very much in the self-interest of Greater Minnesota. We don't talk about extension agents anymore so much. Extension still exists, but that whole kind of notion, I think, seems antiquated to some of us. And yet the ability of the university to be a presence in working with the businesses in your area, working with the people who are engaged in the cutting edge agricultural practices, this is all crucial stuff. So that's my plea, to put that enterprise on your radar as an organization that deserves your support. Right now it looks to me like they could use it. One more question, yes?
You didn't talk about transportation.
No, I didn't.
And this is supposed to be the year for transportation. I'm lucky to be a member of the Highway 14 Coalition group. We've seen what that economic development does in our area for Highway 14, and it was very spring. So given your ability to have perspective, can you tell us how you saw the transportation non-event happen?
Yeah. I didn't write our most recent transportation editorial, but I agree with it when it started out by saying we took a step backwards this year. I really believe that. It seemed so promising at the outset of the legislative session when there was a sort of noises being made at both parties that this issue was too important to become brittle and rigid, and that there would be some compromise at the end. But as the session progressed, as we saw the size of the surplus, as there came from the Republican Party a strong voice, no new taxes voice, positions hardened, and hardened in a way that made compromise, apparently, as you see, not happen, not possible. I don't know what happens in the interim to change that. We have the same cast of characters and a very similar financial situation for the state. The state looks to be headed for another big surplus in the coming session, and if you read the Star Tribune's editorial last Sunday, you learned a little bit about that. It will take, I think, some different kind of pressure from all of you to make a change happen. And as near as I can tell, it has to be roads plus transit, near as I can tell. And it looks to me like with the DFLers in control of the Senate and the governor's office, it has to be some combination of spending now, spending from the general fund, and new revenue. It looks to me like you can't do all repurposing existing funds, and you cannot do all roads. They're just not the votes to do that. And when you think about one state, it's not good for us to do it those ways, because the general fund is already very well subscribed for education and the other purposes we've talked about today. So that kind of a strong message to find that kind of compromise, I think, needs to come from the grassroots. One more question? Yes, Jim Boyd, my old boss.
Lori, you strongly endorse LGA, but now that I don't live in Minneapolis and I live in Grand Marais, it strikes me that the state has become totally untrustworthy as a partner in LGA because it goes like this, and that the only really responsible thing would be to put it into a rainy day fund and not count on it to fund ongoing programs. Is there something you would advocate that the state legislature do, or the governor propose, that could make this a better program and more trustworthy from the local perspective?
Yeah, well, thank you for a very good question. I hope you all heard him. He observed that LGA has been so volatile up and down, and as the state has gone through economic distress, that the state has become an unreliable, undependable partner for local governments. And I'm sure I see heads nodding, people agree with that sentiment. If I were speaking today to an association of school board members and school superintendents, they'd say the same thing. And really, that would be true of almost every entity that is dependent on state money. And that is why you will read editorials in my newspaper that will say, we have a chance now to build up our rainy day fund. Let's do it. We would argue that some significant portion of the surplus that appears in the November forecast should go to beefing up the rainy day fund to stabilize what has always been a volatile revenue stream at the state level. All the 30-plus years I've watched this, it's always been just a roller coaster. And the changes in tax policy we made in 2013 have made that worse, I think. So if we want a more stable revenue stream, we need a bigger reserve fund. We've been told for 20 years that the reserve fund ought to be 5% of our biennial budget. We've never come close. We have a chance this year to come close. And the legislature doesn't have to do a single thing. It's already in state law. All they have to do is allow existing state law to be implemented. A third of the forecasted surplus in November, which could exceed $1.5 billion, is already, by law, going to go to that rainy day fund. That would do a lot, Jim, I think, to stabilize the situation that has been really difficult for local governments, not just cities, but counties and schools as well.
All right, let's hear it for Lori Sturdevant.